Before we begin, wherever you're watching or listening from, leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe to the channel. Tonight, we start with a decisive move that leaders in Washington long feared, largely dismissed, and never fully prepared for. It wasn't the result of drawn-out negotiations or months of public debate. It happened in a single day, and that day sent shockwaves through tech centers in California, forced automakers in Michigan to scramble for alternatives, and may permanently reshape how goods are produced across the United States. What unfolded today in Ottawa crossed the line for the White House. And once that line was crossed, officials in Washington reacted with anger, surprise, and growing alarm. But the deeper problem is simple. The reaction may no longer matter. Canada has effectively shut the door on the United States when it comes to materials America cannot produce on its own, cannot easily replace, and cannot function without. These are the foundational resources behind every electric vehicle, every smartphone, every military aircraft, and every advanced semiconductor the U.S. hopes to manufacture in the years ahead. And right now, Canada controls access to them. For months, there were quiet signs, not public speeches or formal warnings, but subtle signals that Ottawa was preparing for a major shift. Canada moved carefully and deliberately, following a clear strategy built on restraint and timing. What raised alarms in Washington this past week was not increased activity, but silence, delayed meetings, closed-door talks with mining executives, accelerated reviews of foreign investment, a noticeable change in tone from Canadian officials. Then, suddenly, nothing at all. Experts who track Canadian policy recognize the pattern immediately. When Ottawa goes quiet, a major announcement usually follows. For decades, relations between Washington and Ottawa were built on a single assumption. Canada needed the United States more than the United States needed Canada. That belief felt comfortable. It felt familiar. And it was wrong. While Washington focused on China, European trade disputes, and domestic political battles, Canada was quietly strengthening its position, identifying leverage, building partnerships, and waiting for the right moment. That moment came today. This morning, Canada's Resource Ministry unveiled a new framework imposing export limits on 23 critical materials, resources that haven't faced restrictions of this scale in decades. These are measures Canada reserves for serious shifts, retaliation, realignment, or a deliberate step away from long-standing partners. Analysts couldn't immediately say which applied, or whether all three did, but one thing was clear. Canada had changed course, and when a trusted partner makes a move this large without warning, Washington pays attention. This time, the move was enormous. The restricted materials include lithium for electric vehicle batteries, cobalt essential to aerospace and defense, nickel for advanced alloys and energy storage, graphite used in nuclear facilities and consumer electronics, and rare earth elements without which modern chips simply cannot function. Canada holds some of the largest reserves of these materials on Earth. As of today, U.S. companies no longer have guaranteed access. The White House response reflected that reality. It was unusually sharp and unusually direct. In briefing after briefing, officials described Canada's action as aggressive, unexpected, and difficult to reverse. The administration had assumed pressure tactics would work. But pressure only works when the other side blinks, and Canada did not. In fact, today's move ranks among the most calculated trade actions in recent memory. Within hours, Canadian officials contacted U.S. mining firms operating in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, informing them that export approvals were under immediate review. These were not routine checks. They were national security reviews, the kind used only when access may be cut entirely. American executives were caught off guard. Trade groups scrambled, and policymakers in Washington were forced to confront a question they had avoided for years. What happens when your closest partner decides it has had enough? According to sources in Ottawa, Canada is now redirecting shipments to Europe, Japan, and South Korea, countries that secured long-term agreements months ago. Deals with Germany, Japan, and South Korea, quietly negotiated and finalized in advance, were revealed today. Canada moved faster than Washington could react, striking directly at the weakest points in U.S. supply chains. That precision explains the fury in Washington. This wasn't symbolic. It was executable, and it signaled a real shift that could cripple U.S. production if left unchecked. Instead of responding with diplomacy, Washington reached for threats, higher tariffs, penalties, and warnings. No offers, no negotiations, no outreach. And in doing so, it may have pushed Canada even further away. Security analysts now believe Canada's move was also a test, meant to gauge whether U.S. trade policy remained stable after years of unpredictable tariff hikes. Ottawa wanted to see whether Washington would respond with coherence or chaos. What it saw was division, a scattered, inconsistent response that even Canadian officials reportedly found alarming. Unnamed experts have begun calling Canada's strategy separation, a term previously reserved for discussions about reducing dependence on China. The fact that it's now being applied to the U.S. should deeply concern American leaders that Canada's restrictions were carefully timed to prevent stockpiling. That level of preparation signals long-term intent, not impulsive retaliation. This isn't Canada reacting anymore. It's Canada moving ahead. As the day unfolded, more details emerged. Quebec firms confirmed European contracts would take priority, forcing U.S. automakers to look elsewhere. Alberta Power companies reported rare earth shipments already en route to Asia. Provincial governments paused joint projects tied to U.S. military supply chains. This went beyond trade disputes. This was strategic realignment, and it exposed a stark contrast. For every tariff Washington imposed, Canada responded with something stronger. For every warning issued, Ottawa took concrete action. For every assumption that Canada would fold, reality proved otherwise. Washington believed Canada would absorb the pressure for the sake of partnership. They believed Prime Minister Mark Carney would yield. Tonight, the opposite is true. Canada is pressing forward, rewriting the terms of the relationship, and that shift could define North American trade for generations. This is not a short-term standoff or a negotiating tactic. It's a fundamental reassessment of what kind of ally the United States has become. And from Canada's perspective, the verdict is harsh. The timing makes the situation even more volatile. Trump faces mounting domestic pressure, automakers demanding relief, tech companies demanding stability, defense contractors demanding guaranteed supply, and political allies demanding wins ahead of elections. Carney faces his own pressures at home, where public support for standing up to Washington is strong and provinces are pushing for assertive federal action. Both leaders have promised not to back down. When that happens on both sides, compromise becomes nearly impossible. Tonight's White House statement attempted to project strength, warning that Canada's actions undermine continental cooperation. But behind the language was unease. You don't hear that tone from Washington unless the stakes are enormous. And they are. Meanwhile, Carney addressed Parliament calmly and firmly. He declared that Canada would no longer support industries in countries that treat it as a resource to exploit. He called Canada's materials a matter of sovereignty, and said sovereignty is not negotiable. His message wasn't aimed at Washington. It was aimed at Canadians, and polling suggests they agree. What deepens the concern is coordination. As Canada acted, Europe accelerated trade talks. Japan locked in long-term supply agreements. South Korea expanded purchases originally destined for U.S. buyers. These moves didn't happen by accident. They point to a broader strategy, one Washington cannot easily counter. Experts see three possible paths ahead. Canada forcing serious negotiations, Canada gradually reducing dependence on U.S. trade, or Canada building a permanent supply network that excludes America altogether. The third option is what worries Washington most, yet today Washington offered no solutions, only warnings. And Canada has made clear that warnings no longer work. This is now a test of resolve. Canada wants to see whether the U.S. can adapt. Washington wants to prove challenges come at a cost. Businesses want stability. Citizens want strength. Everyone believes the other side will blink first. That belief may be dangerously wrong. Trade trackers report Canadian shipments to Europe surging, while U.S. requests are delayed, rerouted, or denied. The pattern fits a long-term diversification strategy. And Washington's public confusion today sent a message to the world. American trade leadership is fractured. More details will emerge in the coming days. But one truth is already clear. Canada's move was deliberate. It exposed U.S. vulnerabilities, and it forced Washington to confront a reality it ignored for too long. These materials are the fuel of the modern economy, and Canada controls the flow. What happens next depends on Washington's choices. Push harder, and North America may split into competing economic systems. Engage honestly, and dialogue remains possible. But Canada has made one thing unmistakable. It is ready to move on. Tonight, for the first time in years, Washington looks genuinely concerned. The White House has gone quiet. And when Washington goes quiet, it's because it's calculating its next move. Point one fact now stands above all others. The balance of power in North American trade has shifted. Old assumptions have collapsed. And the future of U.S. production is suddenly uncertain. We'll continue tracking every development as this story unfolds.